You know, there are moments in life when you realize the world you thought you lived in, the one you'd built with your own hands, it was just an illusion. And for me, that moment, that absolute shift, happened in stages. But the final, irreversible one, it was a Thursday afternoon, a couple of weeks after it all began. A text message flashed on my phone, Parkside Inn, room 237. Been inside 90 minutes. And in that second, something inside me just completely shut down. The part that wanted to scream, to break things, to drive straight there and kick down a door. It went cold. Quiet. What was left was the locksmith, the problem solver. The man who looked at a broken mechanism and knew exactly how to fix it, or, if necessary, just replace it. To get to that stark, surgical clarity, though, I had to rewind a bit. To a morning just a few weeks earlier, when a single, misplaced object had first started to unravel everything I thought I knew. See, I'm Robert. Been a locksmith for 26 years. 51 now. And in that time, I've gotten pretty good at understanding how things are supposed to work, how they fit, and most importantly, how to tell when something's been tampered with. My business has given my family everything we've ever really needed. But one Wednesday morning in March, I found something in my wife's car that just didn't belong there. And all those years of reading patterns, reading locks, suddenly meant I could read the signs that my marriage was about to fall apart. It was Sarah's wedding ring. Just sitting there, in the cup holder of her Toyota Camry. Resting, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And in 23 years of marriage, Sarah had never, not once, taken that ring off. She wore it in the shower. She wore it when she cooked. She even wore it when we painted the bedroom 5 years ago and got latex all over it. But there it was, just sitting in her car like a forgotten receipt. I stood there in our driveway, holding that ring, and my brain started doing what it always does when something doesn't add up. It started looking for the logical explanation. The simple reason that would make everything make sense again. Her car wasn't even supposed to be home. Sarah had left for work at her usual time that morning, kissed me goodbye like always, told me she'd pick up groceries on the way back. I'd watched her pull out of the driveway at 7:30, just like she did every weekday for the past 8 years since she started working at the medical supply company downtown. But I'd forgotten my phone in her car the night before. We'd been to dinner at her sister Chloe's. So, around 9 o'clock, when I went out to grab it, there was her Camry, parked in the driveway, doors unlocked. The phone was in the side pocket where I'd left it. But when I reached for it, I saw the ring. And my hand just stopped. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't tucked away. It was just there, like she'd pulled it off and dropped it without thinking. Or maybe, like she'd pulled it off and meant to put it back on, but forgot. I picked it up. Felt the weight of it. The same ring I'd saved 3 months to buy when I was 26 and working 2 jobs. And I remember thinking, this object had been on her finger longer than our son David had been alive. I went back inside and just sat at the kitchen table. For maybe 20 minutes, I stared at that ring, trying to build a story that made sense. Maybe her hands were swollen. Maybe she'd been cleaning something at work and didn't want it to get damaged. But the medical supply company didn't require any work that needed jewelry removal. She answered phones. Processed orders. And even if it did, she would have put it in her purse, not left it in the cup holder where anyone could see it. I'm not the jealous type. Never have been. But I know when something doesn't belong where it should be. And that ring didn't belong anywhere except on my wife's hand. When Sarah got home that evening, I was sitting in the living room with the ring on the coffee table in front of me. She came through the door with 2 bags of groceries, talking about how busy the store was, how she'd run into someone from her book club. Then she saw me. And her voice just stopped. "What's that doing here?" she asked, and I watched her face. Really watched it. The way I'd watch someone's reaction when I told them their lock had been picked. "You tell me," I said, keeping my voice level. And she laughed. Actually laughed. She set the groceries down on the counter. "Oh my God, Robert, I went to that new gym on Oakwood Drive before work. You know, the one Chloe was telling me about? I didn't want to lose it in the locker, so I left it in the car and completely forgot to put it back on." She walked over, picked up the ring, slid it back on her finger like the whole thing was nothing. Like it was just a funny mistake. She kissed me on the forehead, then headed to the kitchen to unload. I sat there and felt my chest get tight. Not because I didn't believe her exactly, but because I'd driven past Oakwood Drive twice that week for work calls. And there was no new gym there. Just the same dry cleaner and insurance office that had been there for years. I didn't say anything. I just nodded, helped her put away the groceries. We made dinner like always. Watched television. Went to bed. But I couldn't sleep. I lay there next to her, listening to her breathe. And for the first time in 23 years, I knew my wife had lied to me. Really lied. Not just a small thing to avoid hurting feelings, but a deliberate, constructed story to cover something up. At 2 a.m, I got up and went to my office. Pulled up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Mike's number. Mike and I, we go way back. Worked together doing installations before I started my own business. About 10 years ago, he switched careers, became a private investigator. Mostly corporate stuff, insurance fraud. But I knew he handled domestic cases, too. I stared at his name on my screen for a long time before I typed out a message asking if he had time to talk the next day. And when I hit send, I felt like I was opening a door I'd never be able to close again. I went back to bed, lay there until morning. I realized I might be dealing with something that couldn't be unlocked with any tool I owned. The moment someone decides to verify instead of confront, they've already accepted that trust is gone. Mike called me back the next morning while I was driving to a job site. His voice had that careful tone people use when they know they're about to get involved in something messy. "Robert, I got your message." "What's going on?" I told him about the ring. About the gym that didn't exist. About the feeling in my gut that something was fundamentally wrong. He was quiet for a long time. "Look, man," he said, "I've been doing this work for a decade now. And I'm going to tell you something before we go any further. Once you start looking, you can't unsee what you find. Are you sure you want to know?" I gripped the steering wheel harder, watched the traffic light turn green. And I told him, yes. I need to know. Because living with this suspicion is worse than any truth could be. He said he'd meet me that afternoon at a coffee shop near my office. When I got there, he was already sitting in the back corner with a folder in front of him, looking older than I remembered, more tired around the eyes. Mike laid it out for me in simple terms. He could follow her, take photos, document everything. But it would cost money. Take time. Probably a week or two to establish a pattern, if there was one to find. Or, he said, I could handle the first part myself with a GPS tracker. Something small I could stick under her car. He'd show me how to monitor it from my phone. If she's going somewhere she shouldn't be, you'll know within a couple days, he said, sliding a small magnetic box across the table. It looked like something you'd keep spare keys in. Then you call me, and I'll do the rest. The photography, the documentation. Everything you'd need for a lawyer. I took the device. Felt how light it was. This tiny thing that was about to either save my marriage or end it. I told him I'd let him know what I found. That night, after Sarah was asleep, I went out to the driveway and attached the tracker to the underframe of her Camry, right behind the rear wheel well, where she'd never think to look. Downloaded the app on my phone and watched the little blue dot appear on the screen, sitting stationary in my driveway. The next morning, I watched that dot move from our house to downtown, right to the parking garage next to her office building. And it stayed there all day. I felt a weird mix of relief and disappointment. Like maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe I was just paranoid, looking for problems that didn't exist. But then Friday came. The dot moved downtown like usual. Stayed there until 10:30 in the morning. Then it started moving again. I was replacing locks at a dental office when I saw it on my phone. I watched that blue dot travel across town, away from her work, away from any stores or restaurants she'd normally go to, and stop at a location that Google Maps identified as the Daily Grind Cafe. A place I'd never heard her mention once in 23 years. It stayed there for an hour and 40 minutes. My hands were shaking so bad I had to stop working and sit in my van, just staring at that, willing it to move back to her office, willing there to be some reasonable explanation. I finished the job and drove straight to the Daily Grind, even though the dot had already moved back downtown by then. I sat in the parking lot, looking at this ordinary little building with red vinyl booths visible through the windows, trying to understand what my wife would be doing there in the middle of a workday. The weekend was torture. Couldn't track her without it being obvious, she was home. We did normal things. Took David out for his birthday dinner even though his actual birthday wasn't for another week. The whole time, I felt like I was watching a play where I was the only one who knew the script was wrong. Monday morning, the dot went straight to work and stayed there. And I started to think maybe Friday had been a one-time thing. Maybe she'd met a friend. Maybe it was innocent. But Tuesday, the dot moved again. Same time, 10:30 in the morning. Straight to the Daily Grind. And this time, I was ready. I told my assistant I had a family emergency and got in my van. Drove to that cafe with my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I parked 3 spaces down from Sarah's Camry and waited. At 12:15, the door opened. And my wife walked out. But she wasn't alone. There was a man with her. Tall. Maybe 40. Wearing business casual clothes. They stood by her car, talking for a minute. Then he leaned in and kissed her. Not a quick, friendly kiss. A real one. His hand on her lower back, her hand on his chest. And I watched it happen through my windshield like I was watching a movie about someone else's life. They separated. She got in her car. He walked to a silver Audi parked 2 spots over. I sat there, frozen, until both of them had driven away. Then I wrote down his license plate number on a napkin from my glove box with a pen that barely worked. I didn't go home right away. Drove around for 2 hours. Just drove. No destination. No plan. I remember passing the elementary school where David used to go. Thinking about all the times Sarah and I had picked him up together. How we'd been a team. How I'd trusted her with everything I had. When I finally got home, she was already there, making dinner. She smiled when I walked in, asked how my day was. Busy, I said. And she told me hers had been exhausting. So much paperwork. Her boss was driving everyone crazy with new protocols. Barely had time for lunch. I nodded, helped her set the table. We ate together. And I watched her lie to me with the same face she'd been showing me for 2 decades. And I realized I had no idea who this person actually was. I called Mike that night from my van in the driveway and told him what I'd seen. I heard him sigh on the other end. All right. Send me the plate number. I'll find out who he is. And we'll document everything properly. You're going to need photos. Timestamps. The whole package if you want this to hold up. For the next 2 weeks, Mike followed her. And the pictures started coming in. Sarah and this man, whose name turned out to be Mark, meeting at the cafe. Meeting at a hotel off the highway. His hand always on her back. Her laughing at something he said. That's when I got the text. Parkside Inn, room 237. Been inside 90 minutes. And that's when the cold quiet settled in. The locksmith took over. I met with an attorney named Brenda the following Monday. I brought everything. The GPS logs. The photos. The timeline Mike had built showing a pattern going back at least 6 weeks, maybe longer. Brenda spread it all out on her desk, looked at me over her glasses. "Your wife has been careless, Mr. Robert," she said. "And you've been thorough. This is more than enough for what we need to do." She explained how divorce worked in our state. How assets would be divided. How we'd handle custody, even though David was 19 and technically didn't need custody arrangements. But how documentation of infidelity could affect things like alimony and property settlement. I listened to her talk about my marriage like it was a business contract being dissolved. And I realized that's exactly what it had become. When I left her office 2 hours later, I knew exactly what I was going to do. It was time for the final phase of my plan. And Sarah had no idea what was coming. Documentation doesn't just protect assets. It protects the person who stayed rational when emotions could have destroyed everything they'd built. I spent the next 3 days moving money. Not all of it, just enough that I'd be secure while everything got sorted out legally. Transferring funds from our joint accounts into a business account that only I had access to. Spreading things out so it wouldn't look suspicious. Just normal business expenses and operating costs. Brenda had told me exactly what I could and couldn't do, and I stayed inside those lines. But I made sure that when I left, I wouldn't be scrambling or dependent on anyone. I started pulling my personal items out of the house. Small things Sarah wouldn't notice right away. My grandfather's watch. The few pieces of jewelry my mother had left me. Documents and photos from my side of the family. Packed them in boxes I stored in my office storage unit. David was away at college 3 hours north, finishing up his sophomore year. I was grateful he wasn't home to see what was about to happen. But I knew I'd have to tell him soon. And that conversation scared me more than anything else in this entire process. On a Saturday morning in early April, I woke up at 5 o'clock. Lay there next to Sarah for the last time, watching her sleep. I tried to find some feeling. Anger, or sadness, or something. But there was nothing. Just that same cold, quiet that had settled into me 2 weeks ago. I got up, showered, got dressed. Went through the house one final time, looking at 23 years of life built together. Photos on the walls from vacations and holidays. Furniture we'd picked out. Paint colors we'd argued about. It all felt like a museum of someone else's marriage. I'd already loaded my clothes and essential items into my van the night before, parked 2 streets over so she wouldn't see it empty. And now all that was left was the final message. I took off my wedding ring and set it on the kitchen table next to an envelope. Inside, copies of everything. The photos. The GPS logs. The hotel receipts Mike had obtained. The timeline. And a single sheet of paper with Brenda's contact information and a note that just said, "Your affair with Mark is documented. My attorney will be in touch. Don't try to contact me." I didn't write that I loved her. I didn't write that she'd broken my heart. I just stated the facts, the same way I'd write up an invoice for a lock replacement. I left the house at 6:15 in the morning. Broke my SIM card in half and threw it in a gas station trash can on the way out of town. I'd already set up a new phone number and email address that only David, Mike, and Brenda had. And I'd arranged to stay at an extended stay hotel 40 minutes away. Far enough that I wouldn't accidentally run into anyone we knew. Close enough that I could still manage my business. The plan was simple: make myself unreachable, let the legal process unfold through attorneys, and don't engage with any emotional manipulation or attempts to explain or justify what she'd done. Brenda had warned me that Sarah would try to contact me, would try to explain, would possibly even try to turn things around and make me the villain. And the best defense was complete silence. Let the evidence speak for itself. I found out later from Mike that Sarah came home around 2 that afternoon. She'd been out shopping, apparently. And she'd found the envelope and the ring. According to the neighbor Mike had casually spoken with, there had been screaming. The kind you could hear through walls. She tried calling me and got the disconnected number message. She'd driven to my office and found it locked with a note on the door saying I was handling family matters and all emergency calls were being forwarded to my assistant. She'd even called my brother in Texas, who I'd warned ahead of time, and who told her exactly what I'd instructed him to say, that I was safe, that I needed space, and that she should speak to my attorney. Mike told me she'd hired a private investigator of her own to try and find me. But I'd been careful. I paid for everything in cash. I didn't use social media. I didn't go anywhere near our old neighborhood or the places we used to frequent together. The legal process took 4 months. Everything handled through Brenda and Sarah's attorney. And because of the documentation we had, Sarah didn't fight the divorce terms. She couldn't. The evidence was too clear. The house got sold, and we split it. I kept the business because it was mine before we married and I'd maintained it separately. And there was no alimony because of the infidelity clause Brenda had built into the settlement. David called me 3 weeks after I'd left. That was the hardest conversation of my life. Sitting in a hotel room, explaining to my son why his parents' marriage had ended, why I disappeared without warning. "Dad, why didn't you tell me first?" he asked. And I had to explain that I couldn't risk anyone knowing. Couldn't risk word getting back to his mother before I was ready to leave. I didn't trash talk Sarah. I just told him the facts. Showed him some of the evidence when he asked to see it. And I let him process it in his own time. He was angry at first. Angry at both of us, me for leaving so abruptly, and her for what she'd done. But over time, he understood. And when he had to choose which parent to spend holidays with, he chose me. And that told me everything I needed to know. 2 years after the divorce was finalized, I bought a small house in a town 30 miles from where Sarah and I had lived. Close enough to my business that the commute was manageable, far enough that I felt like I was starting fresh. I dated a little bit. Nothing serious. Mostly just reminding myself that I could still connect with another person without waiting for the betrayal. And then I met Hannah at a community woodworking class I'd taken up. She was a teacher. Divorced herself about 5 years back. No kids. We started talking over coffee after class 1 week. And it was easy. Simple. No games or hidden agendas. We took things slow. Really slow. And after about 8 months, I realized I was happy again. Actually happy. Not just content or comfortable, but genuinely enjoying my life. 5 years after I'd left that ring on the kitchen table, David got engaged to a woman he'd met in grad school. They planned a small wedding in the town where Hannah and I lived, at a vineyard David had fallen in love with when he'd visited us the previous summer. The day of the wedding, I was standing with Hannah near the entrance, greeting guests. When I saw Sarah arrive with her sister. She looked older, harder somehow, like the last 5 years hadn't been kind. Our eyes met across the courtyard, and I watched her face go pale. Not because she was seeing me. I'm sure she'd expected that. But because she was seeing me with Hannah. Seeing me in a tailored suit that fit better than anything I'd owned during our marriage. Seeing me genuinely smile. Seeing that I'd built a life that worked. David had told me she'd married Mark about 2 years ago, and they'd divorced within 18 months. And she'd been alone since then, still living in an apartment near her sister, still working the same job she'd had when we were together. Hannah squeezed my hand and asked if I was okay. And I realized I was completely okay, because Sarah's presence didn't affect me anymore. She was just another guest at my son's wedding, someone I used to know a long time ago. During the reception, David pulled me aside and thanked me for everything. For staying calm 5 years ago. For never bad-mouthing his mother. For building a new life instead of wallowing in what had been lost. And he told me that watching me handle everything had taught him more about strength than anything else in his life. I hugged my son and watched him dance with his new wife. And I looked over at Hannah laughing with some of the other guests. And I thought about that morning when I'd found the wedding ring in Sarah's car. How that one small detail had unraveled everything. But also how it had freed me from a marriage that was already dead. I just hadn't known it yet. Sometimes the strongest thing a man can do isn't fighting for something that's destroying him. It's walking away and building something better. As I watched my son start his own marriage, surrounded by people who genuinely loved him, I knew I'd made the right choice. The real victory wasn't in what I left behind, but in proving that walking away from destruction is the first step toward building something worth keeping. Would you have handled this situation the same way, or should Robert have confronted Sarah directly before disappearing?